This is Sorrel Hillman, and here with me, ready to begin the second in a series of 10 discussions on the general subject of the humanities, is John Mason Brown, the distinguished author and critic. And toward the end of our initial conversation, Mr. Brown, we touched on a subject that I'm hopeful we can now turn our full attention to, and this is the idea of greatness, what it is that makes a man or his work outstanding, or as we so often say, great. Of course, no word probably in the English language has been mangled and misused more than the word great. Mr. Brown, how would you define the word?
May we avoid a definition? The older I become, the greater is my distrust, indeed my dislike for definitions. I've often endeavored to say that a definition is only a verbal girdle that will neither uphold nor include the truth. Can we explore the field of greatness before trying to come to a statement of it rather than a definition? I agree with you, Mr. Hillman, wholeheartedly that greatness and great are mangled words, great in particular. I loathe the word greatness as it is ordinarily employed. I loathe it because I happen to be a critic by employment and by habit. I hate it because it is turning the language into so much Confederate currency. It removes all standards of the ultimate excellence. In common parlance, people say, gee, that's great, or it's a great movie or a great book. They even say a man's a great man, judging a contemporary figure who stands out somewhat above those who are around him.
A great football player, an All-American.
Well, may I say, I think you could have a great football player, just the way certainly Bill Tilden was a great tennis player. Greatness can be achieved in almost any line of activity. I'm not certain about the garbage collector, though I suppose one is superior to the other. It may depend upon the quality of the garbage or the truck, but even he may have a gift for scent. In spite of my dislike of definitions, I happen to have a holy respect for Webster's large dictionary. And in the dictionary, you at least get to a clearing away of the underbrush in the approach to what is the essence of greatness. In Webster, you will find that almost every definition given of the word great has something to do with size or dimension. Each of them touches upon magnitude, whether it's a question of size or space or duration or endowment or personality. And I feel that one of the essential qualifications for the justified usage of great or greatness is an exceptional magnitude or dimension in one field or another. May I come to the landscape for a moment? In reaching for what is, in my mind, the great man in any field would be comparable to the peak, not the mountain range, but the peak that stands above the mountain range with the plain below. It's when any individual in any field is by endowment and the character that maintains endowment so outstanding, when he is a peak among men in any field or period, that's when I think he's great, at least one of the reasons for his greatness.
You wouldn't, however, endorse the Carlyle theory about great men.
Well, Carlyle insisted that history was the story or the record of great men. That seems to me foolish for one reason, and that is there never have been enough great men to go around. And in the second place, alas, as we born in the period of Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin know to our sorrow, there have been so many men of great endowments who have put them to malign rather than benign uses.
You touched on this whole point, I think, in your book, Through These Men, and there are a couple of quite relevant paragraphs.
Well, I was trying to deny the Carlyle theory as being, history being the record of great men, saying that Carlyle was much easier to understand when he defined history as being the essence of innumerable biographies. And I remember trying to add that so history is to a degree, and so it might be as a whole if it included the biographies of the faceless and forgotten men who have been part of it. I mention those because the people who are led have to be led by leaders, and the people who gain acceptance are the leaders who may have great gifts. They don't always. It depends upon whether they have the sufficiency or insufficiency to meet the great challenges which history in every generation has forced on those compelled to face, sometimes triumph over, and often to fail in meeting those challenges.
In the same section of Through These Men, you quote Matthew Arnold.
Well, Matthew Arnold added an entirely different idea, and it's an idea that I think is worthy of very serious consideration. Matthew Arnold said that for a man to be great, you had to have a happy conjunction. You had to have the man and the moment, is the Matthew Arnold theory, that you could have a man potentially great, but if he were born at the wrong moment, he would not have the chance to establish his greatness or have it accepted. He was talking about the man who was born out of date, or in our phrasing, it would be, say, the man who was born ahead of his times or behind them.
Hamlet, of course, said the same thing.
Times were out of
joint, but
for him.
But that's in effect what he meant, isn't it?
Well, let me try to explain a little bit what I mean. Suppose at the present time, in the field of poetry, a poet happened to have the lyric narrative quality of Sir Walter Scott. It is to me highly doubtful that he would succeed, because poetry has passed beyond that special acceptance, and because the era is different, and the preference for content is different. It's no longer the romantic narrative.
Or the verbose narrative.
I'm talking about The Lady of the Lake and Marmion and poems such as that. Scott is an interesting illustration of the man of genius who recognized the necessity of the man in the moment. We all know that he had succeeded as a poet, superbly as a poet, and then suddenly Byron appeared to wake up to find himself famous. And he had changed the whole style of poetry, so Scott, fortunately being able to shift gears, and few writers can do this, abandoned the field, left it to Byron, and started writing the Waverley novels, and then came into a second career.
Another classic example is Thomas Hardy, who, as I remember it, when he found that his novels didn't gain public acceptance or were considered too forward for the Victorian era, simply stopped writing novels after writing his greatest, Jude the Obscure.
Well, I think the time element is certainly a vital factor. Other people have said, Emerson or someone, that a man who is born great never has to wait for the opportunity. He will make the opportunity. I myself think that that is rather optimistic and rather hard to support as a statement. I think the moment can make the man. Not only does the moment have to be right for his special talent, but it can make the man. May I offer one or two illustrations, fairly contemporary? First of all, Mr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and may I mention, without any desire to increase the blood pressure of adamant Republicans, Mr. Roosevelt was someone, and we can all name many such men, who, without the great crisis to face, would never have gone down in history as a man who had greatness in him.
Do we know that?
I can cite unfairly an illustration from a columnist I vastly admire, and this is the famous paragraph which Mr. Walter Lippmann wrote before Mr. Roosevelt's first nomination. Walter Lippmann wrote, "Franklin D. Roosevelt is no crusader. He is no tribune of the people. He is no enemy of entrenched privilege. He is a pleasant man who, without any important qualifications for the office, would very much like to be president." Well, of course, the moment he became president, he proved that he could be a leader, indeed a tribune in the best sense, a tribune of the people, that he was someone who was against entrenched principle. And as his own terms moved on, when he got beyond what was the domestic crisis and was faced with the global crisis, I think even most Republicans, or those who disagreed with him, or those whose vocabulary stopped with that man in the White House, would have to admit that he faced the world crisis as a man who had grown to greatness. Lincoln is another such man whose greatness was discovered by the testing of events. That happens again and again. Would you want other examples?
Certainly.
You want a malign example? Let's hope Lincoln is beyond controversy. Let's go to Hitler now. And I hope he
surely beyond controversy.
He is, I hope, not beyond contempt, but I know he's beyond being a danger. I quoted Mr. Lippmann. Let me quote another prophecy, which was not exactly accurate. I'm quoting Miss Dorothy Thompson, a woman of brilliance and extraordinary prescience about world affairs. She saw Hitler early in his regime, and in a paragraph also cherished by collectors of errors in others. This is the paragraph about Hitler, and Dorothy Thompson says, "When I walked in Adolf Hitler's room, I was convinced that I was meeting the future dictator of Germany. In something less than 50 seconds, I was quite sure that I was not. It took just about that time to measure the startling insignificance of this man who has set the world agog." Well, it became, may I quickly say, and needlessly, agogger and agogger for many years thereafter, until fortunately he went into that cellarage in Berlin with Eva Braun, and went up in, well, Wagnerian flames.
Soon he had more brains than brawn.
But with more brains than brawn, that was the time.
We've touched very slightly on the two basic approaches to history, one through the great men and the other through the times making the man, environment, economics, social history, and all the rest of it. It seems to me that there's the other category of the scholar, the artist, somebody whose greatness might not be recognized for centuries, or might not be appreciated for centuries because there's nobody around erudite enough, perhaps, to be able to understand him or to bring him across to the public.
Certainly, Mr. Tillman, but before we come into the rather specialized fields, let's admit in the division among men, it seems to me they can be easily divided, and are easily and rightly divided, into men of action, meaning the leaders, political or military, who change events by their deeds. Then there are the men of ideas, the aesthetes, whatever it may be, the men of endowments, not action. The artists, the writers, the painters, the architects, they change events too, because their ideas are events in themselves. That is their forcing of history, their shaping of it.
Who, for example?
Well, let's take someone that I certainly don't pretend to understand a word about, though I use his name frequently. Einstein. Let's not get into relativity.
Oh, please not.
No, but there is an idea that certainly among scientists, those who spoke that special language, they may be correcting it now a little bit, arguing with the theory. I shall never argue with the theory, because I never understood it from the beginning. I know that relativity is here. I'm not going to argue with any scientific theories, as a matter of fact.
I wonder why it is that most people accept Einstein's greatness when they can't even begin to understand the most basic elements of his theories.
I don't think our comprehension matters at all, any more than our comprehension matters in many other fields. Many people bow to the greatness of composers, for example, who are almost themselves tone deaf. All of us at the present time have been taught to have, I think, an unholy but understandable respect for the great scientists, yet none of us can explain what these men are doing or how anything works. There are fields beyond the popular range in which greatness certainly can be achieved, and we know it in terms of the benefits mankind has derived from what those men have done. The extensions of thought, the perfections of techniques in medicine, whatever it may be, or the development of rockets or submarines, as in the case of Rickover. I couldn't possibly explain to you how a submarine is made. I've been on submarines, I've been down on submarines, and the captain wasted his time and mine by telling me everything about the ship, and I finally said to him, to save him more bother and myself more boredom, please don't explain all this. I've just learned how to run an outboard motor, and that's as far as I can go. But I still don't have to be able to run a submarine to realize its power or the genius that has gone into its making. In almost any field, greatness has to be measured in terms of effect. We may respond emotionally to poetry, people who have the temperaments to respond to that particular stimuli. We may benefit from science without understanding, but there always has to be the result of what is the magnitude of the endowment. If that endowment is truly dimensional, and large in that sense of dimensional, then it is bound to have its effect upon us. I remember, to go back into autobiography, years ago at Harvard, working with George Pierce Baker, and he was talking about the outstanding writers, even the great ones. And this would have been as true of the great writers as of the ephemeral successes. He said in writing, and he had, of course, playwriting in mind, but this would apply to all writing, he said, when it comes to techniques, there are three. The universal technique, which has outlasted every period because of the common sense demands of the medium. Then the period style, which changes decade by decade according to the atmosphere of history. And most important, the personal technique. And that is the man who has found his own voice in print, his own special way, a way that people may approximate, imitate, but can never duplicate. May I say something about a theory that I have long cherished? Perhaps it's all wrong. It's only a theory about the great writer. I believe that the great writers throughout history have always led double lives. I'm not talking about morals because we haven't time, but I'm speaking about the obligatory duality of the great writer's life. And this sounds like a paradox, and it is one. I believe the great writers have functioned simultaneously in two ways. They have, first of all, been voices, in the sense that they have spoken with the singularity of style and spirit, theirs and theirs alone. but in speaking for themselves so well and so eloquently, so inclusively, they have managed to be echoes to the inner needs of all of us, the semi-mute, to have phrased adequately the hopes, fears, frustrations, desires, experiences that we have had from the beginning of time, all men and women, to have these at last find their way into words. That's the double function, the dual function, the echo and the voice. I believe that is one of the marks of a great writer, if we may move into the realm of literature.
On the other hand, I think one reason, don't you, that the word greatness is kicked around so loosely today is that this is such an age of press agentry and of people promoting other people into alleged greatness.
Unfortunately, this is a period of drum beating when the drums can be heard further than ever before because of the media of mass communication. But may I say, at the present time, the horror is you can achieve the illusion of greatness in the popular mind by the dimensions of your bust rather than the size of your brain. It is a question of which area is to be stressed if you're reaching for the ultimate values of greatness, and I hope those are the ones we're discussing.
Even so, I think that historically there was always a discrepancy between the reputation of a man at the top of his career and the final judgment on him. In our history, I suppose Andrew Johnson is a classic example of that.
Oh,
A man who was pilloried, denounced.
Well, he was pilloried and denounced, even as many historians feel that Lincoln would have been, had he survived and had to face the issues of settling the Civil War rather than winning it.
True, but Andrew Johnson is now considered a fairly good president.
He has been rehabilitated, so has Richard III, saved from Shakespeare, so that gives both you and me a chance.
Well, he hasn't been cleared of that murder yet, or the series of murders.
Those murders sometimes can contribute to the myths of history. I'm not recommending them. I can say they can be, bloodshed can be a reputation gained.
Well, you know, in this connection, there's a new book by Colonel Pappy Boyington of World War II fame, in which he says, "Just name a hero and I'll prove he's a bum."
I have read that quotation. I'm sorry to say I haven't read the book, but I have read the reviews, and I remember that quotation. You have introduced into the discussion a word that is almost irrelevant. You have used the word hero. We are talking about greatness. Heroic is one manifestation of greatness. The perfect man, the man who hasn't got some quality of bum in him, I doubt such a mortal man has ever been born. I can't imagine a man that any of us would like to be with if he didn't have some quality of the bum in him. I think it's the offset there that helps to accentuate, underline, and guarantee the qualities of greatness. Men can be great not only because of, but in spite of. And all men are great in spite of being mortal.
Well, that's extremely interesting, the distinction you're making
said so far
between the word greatness and the word, or great, and heroic. Because I think most of us do confuse the two.
Well, certainly if William Wordsworth has been regarded, I'm not saying you and I share that earlier opinion, but certainly he, in literature, alas, as a great poet, and the best of Wordsworth, as winnowed out by Matthew Arnold, when he was saved from his mediocrity and preserved at his best, certainly he has earned and kept the name great. But no one will ever pretend that William Wordsworth was heroic.
I do think this distinction between heroic and great confuses a great many of us. I'd like to read you one little quotation from a book by Marshall Fishwick of Washington and Lee called American Heroes, Myth and Reality. And he says, "As conditions change, so does the heroic guise. In times of crisis, we seek the solidarity of Lincoln or Wilson. When we are complacent and bored, in turn, we change to a Buffalo Bill or an Al Capone. We even idolize mediocre men like U.S. Grant or Warren G. Harding when they suit their ages."
We are now coming back to the man of the moment and the atmosphere of the time. Let me go back to a question even of war phrasing before we come to the acts of war. I think you may agree with me that the vocabulary released in wartime is of a special kind because it supplies a special need. It has the drum rolls of great phrases. It has what in peacetime is called fustian. And when peace comes, we try to forget what we can't live at the emergency tilt, and we tend to be embarrassed by the very thing that sustained us. But let the next crisis come, and we return precisely because of the eternal needs of war to the kinds of phrases which have always sustained men in moments of war. Remember, if you are talking the heroic in the sense of physical reflex, the spirit that rises to the challenge of an enemy, once you have peace and the enemy is supposedly turned into a new friend or a forgiven foe, the chances of using a sword against him are rather slight. You may remember, now this is a question of leadership, I remember a play from years back called Red Rust, which dealt with the Soviet Revolution and a cell block. And the whole point of that play was that in Russia, this was a Russian play. At that time, there was apparently more interchange. But the point of the play was that the men who had made the revolution possible, this is the murderers at the barricades, etc., were the men that the Communist Party was trying to liquidate once the immediate needs of bloody street fighting were over. They were the bullies who had the fists to implement revolution. But once the revolution had been achieved, they didn't want those same bullies everywhere. They were too dangerous to the revolutionary leaders. That is a shift of time.
I would like to ask you to name me, going way, way back for the time being, some examples of greatness of various forms.
When you say go way, way back?
Yes.
Let's start with the Bible, which, I'm now speaking of the Old Testament, not the glory and the greatness of Christ. I'm speaking now of the Old Testament, of the characters who have shown, such as Moses, the supreme gift of leadership, the patience to wait, the patience to go through the wilderness, to go to the verge of the promised land, even though the promised land was not seen. Or take Job, the man who had the gift for defiance, who dared shake his fist even at God and was at last beaten it into a kind of acquiescence. But the greatness was there, the moral splendor and the challenge certainly was there. David is that boy who had the moment of greatness before he proved his subsequent greatness as a king.
And then had his decline.
Well, the decline and fall overtake more than the Roman Empire. That seems to be the mortal pattern. If you last long enough, you decline at least physically. You usually decline in other ways.
Leaving the Bible, who would be...
Don't leave the Bible. That is so ungrateful.
Well, I'll just put it aside for a second then. Who among the Greeks and Romans, for example?
Certainly Pericles in his great years was an extraordinary leader. Certainly, well, you can find greatness among the Greeks in that extraordinary flowering of Greece. Greatness was more common, perhaps, than it has been any place else in one small city.
Well, it was so common that one almost suspects the historians of undue flattery.
Well, no, I'm talking about the people who were alive before great playwrights.
The Golden Age.
Well, the Golden Age, and in statesmanship, and Phidias and Scopas, etc., in sculpture, and then the architects. We in our own country, out of emergency, did at the moment of the revolution manage to produce a crop of great men in the Adamses, in Jefferson, in Washington, in Hamilton, a crop of great men such as few countries, I believe, in recorded history have ever produced simultaneously. It was one of our high pieces of historic good fortune.
One of those men, of course, Franklin, presumably would have risen to greatness, crisis or no crisis, because, of course, he was older than any of those men, and he'd had ample time to prove himself before anything really developed, before the new nation came about, or the revolution.
I myself believe Franklin and Jefferson were the two men among the so-called founding fathers of that generation most complete in realizing what was then the ideal. That is, the ideal of the whole man, the man who could take all knowledge as his province. Knowledge was more limited than it now is. There was less to know. There was a smaller world. Now, of course, greatness raises another question, and that is, can a great man at the present time be a whole man in the 18th century sense? Does he have to specialize to such an extent that he develops one arm and never uses the other? We know many geniuses who are not great as men, nor great in spirit, nor great in toto. By their very overdevelopment in one line, they have achieved their greatness and their recognition and done their service.
Sheer competitiveness today perhaps has something to do with it.
There are, of course, exceptions. Let's go back to, again, the whole man, somebody such as Leonardo, who is the perfect embodiment of the multiply endowed Renaissance man. Then many people feel that is only a Renaissance endowment. But let's come to the figure in our own time, who certainly is the closest that any contemporary has come to being the fulfillment of that whole man, the Renaissance man, the Leonardo type in a different field. I'm speaking reverently, gratefully of Sir Winston Churchill.
Probably the one example, actually, you could name today, isn't he?
Well, certainly he has, in more fields, done more. As historian, as maker of history, as even as a therapeutic painter. Bricklayer, anything you want. This is the fullest life, I suppose, of our time. I really believe that with all my heart. Churchill's career, a magnificent career, has been something like a tapestry, as bold, as many colors, as far-flung. And compared to that tapestried career of Churchill, most men don't even lead the lives of watercolors or of miniatures or of penny postcards. That is the scale of endeavor and of inclusion. This is the mind and the interest that has reached everything. You remember Mr. Churchill's favorite word, the word that he has used even in describing his approach to painting.
What's that?
When he tried between jobs, when he was out of office and out of favor in World War I, when he was suffering from what he called the bends which overtake men relieved from the pressures of great duty, and he turned to painting and he tried timidly to paint. And Mrs. Lavery came out and said, "Oh, no, 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 no. Not that timid dot on that blank canvas, a stroke, a wide stroke." And so he said, in effect, and I reached for the brush, and swallowing my timidity, I with vigor covered the canvas, knowing from then on that audacity was the thing that was needed, and he has had audacity in every field.
You certainly can't imagine Churchill saying of himself what Napoleon said of himself: "If I had succeeded, I should have been the greatest man the world has known."
Napoleon, alas, to the horror of Europe, almost succeeded. In my youth, before you had had Hitler, Mussolini, et al., before you had had the threat of military conquest and the dictator, tyrant type, and the soldier taking over, the figure on white horseback, Napoleon was most reverentially dealt with in all books. He was accepted by such pacifists as Emerson as one of the examples of representative men of true and great leadership. But Napoleon, of course, with these splendid endowments, finally was destroyed because the endowments were put to a purpose that proved, in spite of its moments of greatness, many moments of greatness, I mean in the planning and the thinking and the constitution and the drawing up the comédie, all the minor things as well as the battles and the conquest, he was undone by what was essentially wrong in the concept. What was wrong in the idea destroyed what was good in the man, and I don't think too much was good there.
Is character necessary for greatness?
Certainly.
What is the connection between the two?
The greatest men have had both great character and great endowment. Napoleon had great endowments, and I honestly believe great character. There was granite there, some kind of great strength in the inner being and the will and the mind that was the firm rock upon which his achievements were based. Now, whether you admire the achievements has nothing to do with what is the character that must have been there to achieve what Napoleon achieved. The strength, the galvanic strength of personality, not only to conquer your own country and impose your will upon it, but to come near to conquering the whole of Europe and impose your will upon it too. No man without character can do that. Let me distinguish between character in the Sunday school sense and character in the sense of successful achievement for a while in any field. Let me make this difference, that just as you may have a malign tumor or a benign tumor, so it seems to me that that excess of endowment, which is genius or greatness, can be either malign or benign. Certainly all of us hope that the great men will have benign characters, the qualities of goodness that we recognize and admire.
You don't believe, I take it, that a man has to succeed in the conventional sense to be great?
Napoleon succeeded until the moment when well, Spain was the beginning of the undoing, the Spanish campaign. But the world's recognition of his failure was, of course, when he stood at the gates of a burning Moscow, when that scorched earth, in this case, scorched city policy, destroyed him of his greatest plum. Then that was the end of really the great military glory. He was undone, and this is the usual thing, because he had overextended his army out of sheer ambition. He did not regard nature or the Russian temperament or anything, and winter helped destroy him as much as the Russian army that had the intelligence to wait.
It's the fact that he pushed beyond what seemingly were the limits that makes him great to William Bolitho, who certainly has written as brilliantly as anybody about great people.
Oh, please don't let me dismiss Napoleon. I remember with proper fear and humility the story of the second lieutenant who addressed the War College in Washington, and the subject of his address of the second lieutenant was the military mistakes of Napoleon. I don't mean in any sense to run Napoleon down on the basis of his greatness as a soldier, or even his greatness in many fields as a man. But so he was against the gods. He was in Belitho's phrase.
Yes.
He was the man who had what is commonly called the great defy. And I perhaps phrased all the Napoleonic description inadequately. What I meant was there was something wrong in the vision which ultimately condemned the achievement.
That's true of most of the people Belitho wrote about in that book.
Well, may I go back to the question you asked, and that is, wasn't it in terms of Emerson? Does a great man have to be successful? Rock Hunter, we come down to what is success. If you mean financial success, that is one thing. If you mean recognition, that is another. There are writers, let me stick to writers for a moment, who want prestige rather than success, and they are embarrassed by success. But the generating force should be in the writer is to communicate with as large a public as possible. And the great writers certainly have won the world's respect by reaching the largest number of people, at least on their bookshelves. They may not always be read.
Of course, there are the classic examples of people like Herman Melville who won absolutely no recognition for a good 100 years or more.
Well, that is certainly true. The true recognition of Melville was the posthumous rediscovery. He had his champions in his day, but he didn't have his public. But he won his public, as a matter of fact, I remember from I believe it was the 20s, when Dr. Canby and Christopher Morley and all these people began to rediscover him, just as at the present moment, Joseph Conrad is being rediscovered. That is the common fate of authors, even the ones who have won success and recognition, to drop out of sight, to have a whittled reputation the minute the obituaries have been finished. And then if they are really good, they are rediscovered and return, and sometimes gain wider audiences than they ever gained. Let's admit that there are some talents meant only for small audiences. And now go back to the echo and the voice. But if the echo is large enough to include the frustrations or experiences of thousands and millions of people through our time, then they win the wide acceptance. Is Shakespeare a success? Certainly by every box office standard, you would have to admit that no playwright in history has ever played to such audiences or to such box offices. Certainly the Bible is a bestseller and has been for years and years and years and years. Mr. Shaw, who began by appealing to a small audience and had to fight hard for it, has now, posthumously, once again, he's had them in his lifetime before his death, but he has the largest royalties of almost any playwright, any modern playwright, not contemporary.
Well, speaking of Shakespeare, you remember the Malvolio line, some men are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. Shakespeare, of course, had no greatness thrust upon him.
Well, I think he was born great, inevitably. The greatness was within him. But I also think that he happened to achieve it. When you consider that he is the third child in that family of 8, when you consider that all the children, to the best of my knowledge, were brought up under the same conditions, then you come to what is the eternal and tantalizing mystery of greatness. Why does the lightning strike only 1 out of the 8, when the environment, the other, supposed to be so important, the background, and heredity are all the same? This is the mysterious thing about greatness. Greatness is the inexplicable factor, or endowment, or touch. I've never seen anyone able to describe what is greatness, any more than I've ever seen anyone able to describe what is the creative process in art.
I don't know whether we've sufficiently stressed the fact that greatness is not necessarily incompatible with surliness, moodiness, unattractiveness, or various other qualities that we don't admire. Isn't Wagner the classic example of that?
Wagner certainly must have been as difficult to live with, to have around the house. I should think next to King Lear, he would be the most undesirable weekend guest. But you're not asking of geniuses
that
they be sent to a finishing school, because that would only finish them, usually. You're not asking them they be pebbles worn down by the sea to characterless conformity. You are asking them to release their talents. You may hope, and properly hope, that they are housebroken as well as God-endowed, but it doesn't necessarily follow that the two go together. And when I speak of greatness of spirit, I'm not speaking of Wagner's bad habits or disagreeable habits, his impossibility as a companion for most people, but I'm asking for what he had, and I go back to spiritual dimension. Whatever he was personally is one thing, The spirit that was released in his music is truly titanic. It is of the highest kind, and that is not a question of behavior or misbehavior. This is the release of spirit that genius demands and that is the proof of greatness. I want to say one other thing about Mr. William Shakespeare, that even Shakespeare had that kind of cycle of being denied and then rediscovered. When Shakespeare died, a different group of writers with different ideals moved in, and the university men, so-called, took over. And then when, after the Restoration, if you recall, the men who had been brought up during their years of exile in the French court to respect the classicism of the French court, neoclassicism, turned on Shakespeare as a barbarian, even as Voltaire was to call him a brilliant barbarian. And they began to rewrite him. They continued to rewrite him even as they did in David Garrick's day. They continued practically up into Sir Henry Irving's time, when they would chop acts to make scenery, to turn him into a four-act scenic investiture. And then suddenly people began to realize that Shakespeare knew what he was doing, and no one who wrote like Henry Arthur Jones or Pinero had that technique superimposed upon the freewheeling technique of Shakespeare. If you go to any of the Stratfords, Avon, Ontario, or Connecticut, you will, I believe, find that one of the great advantages of the theaters in which Shakespeare is now played is that those theaters guarantee architecturally that what was his playwriting structure, as well as the glory of his verse, is preserved.
Which is one reason that the playhouses are so enormously successful, I think.
Well, I think he's speaking
Certainly
in his own
Canada.
voice, and his technique, once again. But beyond endowment, there is a dimension that I must mention, and that is a spiritual endowment. I believe in poetry, writing, painting, architecture, anything. You can have splendid technical facility. You can have every metric skill as a poet. You can be the master of the most extraordinary style as a novelist. You can have fine perceptions. But there has to be something bigger than the talent to direct the talent and give it its ultimate importance. There is a kind of helium of heart that has to be there. There has to be the capacity for moral indignation, for using that talent for a purpose. May I give you an illustration? May I take two extraordinary writers, Sir Max Beerbohm and George Bernard Shaw. Certainly when it comes to the employment of language, the writing of satire, the felicity of phrase, delectable sneer, and even the enchanting appreciation. No writer in the England of Beerbohm and Shaw wrote better and none as well as Beerbohm himself. But what was lacking in Beerbohm, so huge in his talents, I believe, was that bigness of conscience and that moral passion which made Shaw, as he himself said, an event. He would have been the first to concede that he was an event rather than a man.
I don't think, though, that Beerbohm ever had any illusion that he was anything more than
I'm not talking about what he thought of himself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about what is the ingredient within him and the ingredient within Shaw that made the one man brilliant, admirable, delectable, treasurable, whereas the other, who was amusing, impudent, stimulating, brilliant, brainy, in a way Beerbohm actually wasn't, it lifted him into, well, beyond the timberline. There, we go back to the timberline, there has to be that moment of getting to the heights.
Well, I think another element of greatness can also be defined in terms of Beerbohm, who said something once about being a man of very, very few talents, who knew how to employ them with dexterity. Beerbohm had no great ambition. Shaw really cared, and I think that helped to make him great.
Beerbohm, don't forget, is a man who, for at least 20 years in his career, lived in the past. Shaw was a man, even in his nonage, or even dotage, who was always living in the future. He had never abandoned the world. He believed in evolution. He even believed in, he was romantic enough behind that white and satanic beard to believe in the perfectibility of man. Beerbohm never believed in the perfectibility of man. Never.
Shaw is also a classic example of what you were saying earlier when you said no man could be great without also having some fairly wrong or objectionable qualities. And Shaw had all of those in abundance, don't you agree?
Oh, certainly. And some of them deliberately. Because one of his weapons, a weapon that he used brilliantly, was irritating other people, making them so mad that he won the world's attention. He kept center stage and played the part of buffoon to play the part of prophet. That was the means by which he, I think, advanced. May I use an image which may be ridiculous? I'm talking about the spirit now, the dimension I think I said helium of the heart and spirit. I didn't mean to caress the phrase. I go back to it to make
You
a
weren't
point.
gaseous.
You know, well, I'm going to be gaseous now because I'm coming to the image of light. Let me take a very simple thing. Let me take a pumpkin as used in this country for Halloween.
And in espionage.
In espionage. Oh, that's right, those papers. Well, let's forget the papers and come back to Halloween. You could have carved the most perfect pumpkin imaginable. Sizable, splendid, with the correct contour. But that pumpkin is really never fulfilled, at least as a Halloween pumpkin, until the candle is lighted within. And it's that candle within the perfect form that seems to me to give the light that is needed in the author who has all the literary skills, plus this other dimension that I have in mind.
Well, isn't part of that spirit rebelliousness? Aren't the writers we've been talking about today, the ones that we admire, all of them rebellious nonconformists? And what about the present-day conformity? Isn't that a major threat?
Conformity is the enemy of greatness. What the pressures of conformity do is very simple. They plow down or plow under. They bulldoze into a common level. Conformity plows down both the mountain peak and the mountains below and wants a plain instead of a high range. There are too many people who prefer comfort to distinction, popularity to courage, security to struggle, and all greatness demands struggle, the eagerness to face the struggle. I'm one of the people who even now, in spite of conformity, in spite of a terrified world, in spite of our own manifest national confusions, refuse to believe that greatness is not here and abroad and in this world. I do not believe the world today is peopled by pygmies. I do not believe that giants walked the earth only a long time ago.
All right, well, where do you find greatness today? Who are some of the great contemporaries?
That is a madly dangerous question to attempt to answer.
Nevertheless, I think it's worth throwing in.
Well, the reason I say it is enormously dangerous is this. Earlier, I have tried to express my hatred of any squandering of the word great. It's an extraordinary, proud, and special word. It is the summit of all summit words. I would be a coward, however, if I avoided your question completely. But let me start with the theater, a field not unknown to either of us. I would say within our lifetimes that Eugene O'Neill, in spite of the unevenness of his talent, in spite of the fact that he probably never wrote a single play that was great throughout, had qualities of greatness which lifted him above all contemporary or modern tragic dramatists.
Today, you'd be drawn and quartered for saying less, although, you know, who can tell whether 100 years from now people will still feel that.
May I say, this is what gives me any courage to answer this impossible question. Since none of us, not even you, young as you are, will be alive 100 years from now to judge greatness, abiding greatness.
Pessimism will get you nowhere.
It'll get me off this earth ultimately. But say, since we won't be here, it seems to me just as well to bask in what we recognize as greatness in our own time. The people who have served us greatly in various ways. I don't think a person alive, man or woman, or even talking dog, that wouldn't admit that Winston Churchill will be an abidingly great man and is one of the great figures of history. No one will deny that, especially Americans.
What about other writers? We were talking about O'Neill writing for the theater. What about
My
novelists?
memory has not failed me utterly. I do remember that far back. But Mr. Churchill was the writer as well as the man of action. I can't honestly think of a comparable playwright. After the death of Shaw and with O'Neill's death, I know that there are men of high and extraordinary talent, such as Tennessee Williams and Arthur Miller, but I cannot put them on that other elevation.
I often suspect that it was O'Neill's great gift for monumental tedium which has elevated him in the public consciousness. Neither Miller nor Williams can be quite that dull, therefore not quite that awesome either.
I will say were more merciful in their time sense. Those dramas of Mr. O'Neill that you're thinking of, other than the one-act plays, the great long sagas, the ones that were as long as Wagner played and then played back, were once described accurately by Richard Watts as mastodonic. And I do think a blue pencil would have lifted them into this area of greatness. They're much too long for their own good, for the pelvises of the audience, or for the needs of the plays at hand.
What about the other writers in your lifetime?
I am proud to have lived on this planet as a contemporary of such a novelist as Thomas Mann, most of whose works I have found utterly unreadable. I am delighted to have lived as a contemporary, indeed as an acquaintance, of Thomas Wolfe, many of whose novels are attacked by many people nowadays, but the lyric quality of those novels and the strength and the quest all seem to me to set them apart and make them unique. I am proud, of course, of the workmanship and the true artistic gift of someone such as F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Are you trying to say that each one of these novelists is a great man, a great novelist?
I think Mann has by many critics been saluted as great. Wolfe has. Then there was the rediscovery, of course, of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And though his was wasted talent because he was such a poor custodian of it, yet the simple fact remains that it was an extraordinary talent. Let's not minimize it. At the present moment, John Marquand at his best is as near to what is the Thackeray of our time as any writer. We do not hesitate from schoolroom memories to refer to Thackeray because he's safely dead as a great satirist. And 50 years, 100 years from now, if people are still here and if they are still capable of reading, that they are very apt to refer to Mr. Marquand as our great satirist of these years.
I would personally doubt that very strongly. I think he'll only live for the late George Apley, if for anything. However, you've left out a couple of men I would have thought of as giants.
I would spring with you to mention Hemingway. Hemingway seems to me as an influence and also as a performer to have a preeminence, perhaps, as some of these other men that I've mentioned.
Well, he's certainly been more influential as a craftsman than Fitzgerald, to name one, or certainly Wolfe. Wolfe's influence has all been to the bad.
Well, that is your opinion,
yes.
And you stated as if you were the head of all the churches. I happen to be, as I grow older, slightly more tolerant of opinion than that, and less convinced that my own is
correct. I have only the iconoclastic hordes behind me.
Well, I hope they'll get further back. You will agree, wouldn't we, on Mr. Hemingway?
Certainly. The thing that puzzles me is that you've left out two, to me, really major people, if not great, awfully close to greatness, Joyce and Proust, both of whom squeezed into your lifetime.
I don't think there's anyone who now reads, and certainly no one who writes that I know of, who does not admit the greatness of Proust and the enormous influence that he had in discovering what was under the mind and behind the motive of human action. And when it comes to Joyce, I think there again you have to divide the career to what was the accomplishment, the open, understandable, communicated accomplishment, such as in the portrait of an artist as a young man, or Dubliners, and then you would come into what, to me at least, is the fascinating and all-important experiment of Ulysses, with its chapters that are dull beyond belief, and Finnegan's Wake, which I, out of ignorance, just cannot bring myself
well, I can't understand.
to read. I've never gotten more than 10 pages in it, but that has nothing to do with influence. I'm talking about what was the admirable performance.
Well, would you say that both those men were great writers?
Yes.
Joyce and Proust?
Yes.
Well, then,
without question.
What about other fields, other categories of greatness?
Before we leave literature, let's touch upon two figures. Robert Frost, as a poet, will survive. He has the elements within his range of work, endeavor, within the acre that he has chosen to make his own. It seems to me he has done an extraordinary thing. I believe that T.S. Eliot, who has been so over-perfumed, over-venerated, so kowtowed to, is a man who, as an experimenter, again as an influence, ultimately as a poet in certain poems, in certain plays which managed to become plays in spite of Eliot, and particularly in his essays, is one of the universally admittedly outstanding figures in literature today. I've never particularly admired the plays. I agree with what Garson Kenan said about the confidential clerk. He said it was under his head, but the highbrows thought they understood it.
What about other categories, then?
Oh, we could turn to admirals, generals, we could turn to scientists, educators, and I wish today that I could say statesman. In almost any field of endeavor, you do find the person who, because of special endowments, unique qualities, stands out and achieves what I would be willing, with qualifications, to describe as greatness. I'm only trying to say, and say with all my heart, that these people in their fields, the few, all too few that I have mentioned, are people I think we will acknowledge as leaders and great leaders. And we acknowledge them because we are glad to be led by them for the simple reason that we are happy to be led where they lead us. When in any field of endeavor, they have given us a better vision of life than we had before, or opened new, miraculous, and exciting vistas for us, then I feel that we all recognize, gratefully, proudly, and with excitement, that we are in the presence of greatness and its greatest fruition.
Well, I think you've established the point that there does seem to be a strong relationship between the greatness of a man or his work and its effect on the rest of the world. And with this in mind, Mr. Brown, I should like to raise during our next discussion the whole question of the artist, of the writer, and of his awareness of the times in which he lives. For instance, should a writer go off and mope in some lonely ivory tower, or should he actively participate in the economic and social and political life of his era? And that's to say, to what extent can or should the artist influence and affect his times? And, by the same token, to what extent can his times influence him?